All right, all right. Hello, everyone. Hi. I see people tuning in. I'm going to give a couple of minutes for any latecomers. In the meantime, I'll share a few things about the webinar and myself. So I'm Akos. Those of you who've been coming to the webinars, there's no change in the host. There's always a change in the guest. As far as I'm concerned, I'm the CEO of Airtime, which is an autonomous discovery platform turning user calls into product insights. You can run user research, sales, or customer service calls through it, and it identifies for you key feedback patterns in a couple of clicks. Now, today I'll be talking to Dalia about turning user interviews into conversations. And what you need to know about Dalia is that she's a shining star in the user research world. She's the director of UX research at Wise. She led the UX research team at Miro, and she elevated the research game at Shopify beforehand. And before we get to learn a lot from her and listen to her stories and experiences on user interviews, I want to get a few technicalities off the table. So first of all, if you have any questions, if you have any topics that you'd like to share, please put that in the chat. I see that a few people already commented. People from the US joining us. I love hearing where all of you are coming from. So feel free to put it in the comments. Now, also your questions. The second topic, in case you'd like to do a background check on either of us, or you'd like to get in touch afterwards, the best ways to do that is through LinkedIn. So I'm going to put our profile links in the comments as well. Third thing, in case you're curious about airtime, how you can identify emerging patterns and insights with user calls with a few clicks, check out our website and give it a spin. For all of you who are here today, I'm also offering a secret promo code, which gives you 25% off for 3 months. I'll put all the details in the comments, but it's something that I wanted to share with you up front. Now, having said that, and without further ado, let's transfer to the main part of our discussion, which concerns you, Delia. I'm grateful that you accepted my invitation. I'm humbled, and I'm very much looking forward to chatting with you. I think the first question that I ask from every single guest that I have is to tell a little bit about yourself.
Cool. Thanks, Akash. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the warm intro. I think you've covered, I guess, a lot of the sort of logistics about where I come from. So I'm trying to think of, what else can I share that maybe isn't in my LinkedIn profile? So yeah, I'm working at Wise right now. My training was actually in math and engineering, and I ended up as a researcher almost a bit accidentally in my grad school when I was trying to do quantitative human-computer interaction research and realized that all of the behavioral data that I had was not giving me enough information about the people that I was trying to understand. And so I walked over to the social science library and took out a book on qualitative research, which a friend of mine who was doing sociology research had recommended. And yeah, that was the beginning of learning how to do interviews, learning how to do qualitative analysis, and yeah, I guess got me to where I am today.
Amazing. Just a sneak peek into my past, I studied financial mathematics, and here we are. But today, there you go. Maybe that's the new track for the next generation of UX researchers, math.
Yeah.
Now, um, the topic for today is or like let me call it a theme is our conversations. And we had a chat a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this webinar, where you shared your approach about turning user calls into conversation, and I was just wondering if you could walk us all of us through what you exactly mean by turning a user interview into a conversation, and what benefits does it have as opposed to a regular user interview.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So I think to add a bit of context on how we got here, Akshay had reached out to me to see if I wanted to do this type of conversational webinar with him. And I showed up to our meeting 7 minutes late, and the reason why I was late is because I had gone on a mini rant with a research ops person on my team about how non-researchers are conducting user interviews and user conversations. And so when I came into the conversation with you, Akash, we were supposed to kind of discuss, oh, what are some interesting topics for a webinar? And it just so happened that this was so top of mind for me that it ended up becoming the topic of today's webinar. But let me backtrack a little bit and tell you about what was happening then. So I think that there is a really sort of big discourse blowing up in the non-research world, particularly in the PM world, around this idea of talking to users. And there's a lot of podcasts, a lot of conversations, a lot of people being told, hey, you need to talk to your users, you need to talk to your users. And I don't think it's necessarily something new, but I don't know if other folks who are tuning in have noticed that it's gone a little bit into like overdrive in the past couple of years, but I've definitely seen that. And I'm seeing instances of non-researchers who are kind of reaching out to me or my research ops team and saying, hey, just want to reach out to users and ask them this thing. Or we have a bunch of users who reached out to us via support contacts, and I want to reach out to them and kind of drill a little bit deeper into what they, what they've talked to us about, or even to the point of some people saying, hey, I want to cold call some customers and ask them a few questions. And, we start to have this discussion. It's like, okay, what are you trying to learn about? Like, how are you going to prepare? And the response is more often than not just, oh, no, it's not research. It's just, I just want to talk to them. I just want to ask them a few questions. And where I start to get frustrated is, do you understand how difficult it is to just hop on a call, to schedule a call with a person, hop on a call with them and just ask them a few questions without zero preparation of how you're going to ease into those questions, what you're going to start with, what you're going to talk to them about? How are you designing this experience in a way that actually is making the person you're talking to feel comfortable enough that they're going to answer your questions? Like, how do you turn this from essentially what could come across as a spammy, like telemarketing call into something that actually feels genuine and that is not only worth your time, but makes it feel for them like it's worth their time to have this conversation? And so this idea that people think they can wing it is one that kind of spurred this topic on for me. And I think maybe as researchers, when we spend so much time preparing for our interviews and making the conversations seamless, I wonder if that's sending a signal to people that it just comes naturally, that it's just easy to hop on a call with and talk to someone, where the reality is that there's a lot of work that goes into designing an interview to make it seem like a conversation rather than, like an awkward interrogation or something like that. So that's how we got here.
Yeah, I remember that. And you're in a particular like challenging environment in a sense that Wise is a financial service provider, and
Mhm.
finance is typically a sensitive topic. It's not like you're talking about different Converse shoe designs,
Yeah.
but personal finances, or in some cases savings, or plans for the future. So I definitely see the challenge and the importance that you attach to that. What I was wondering, as I was getting ready for our conversation, is that was there like a moment in your career with like or an experience that you can pinpoint where you realized like this should be a conversation with a participant rather than an interrogation. So were you maybe an interrogator in the beginning and switch, or were you always the conversational person? I'm curious where you're coming from and where this sort of approach stems from.
Yeah, yeah. Before I get into that, I actually want to touch on
Yeah.
the point that you made around how this is a concern at a company like Wise because of the sensitive nature of discussing finances. But I would say that it's probably healthy to apply that mindset to just about any topic or problem space that you spend time in, because you never know what a topic can really mean to your participants, and something that might seem really casual or benign to you can actually have a much deeper meaning or much deeper sort of like emotional background to a participant you're talking to. So I would say, like, regardless of the type of study or the type of problem space you're operating in, to approach it with a certain level of sensitivity and preparation and like comfort of the user in mind is always really important. And for me in particular, I would say that it wasn't so much a moment where I made a pivot, but rather my own self-awareness as someone who is
Hmm.
awkward. And I I find that when I tell people that I'm an awkward person, they tend to not believe me, or they tend to think that, I'm just trying to be humble. But the reality is that even in day-to-day interactions with the vast majority of human beings I interact with, I feel a certain amount of anxiety. I wouldn't say that I have like full-blown social anxiety, but I spend like an inordinate amount of time in my head thinking about what I'm going to say, how I want to respond. I'm very bad at small talk. If you catch me off guard and I'm not prepared and you just ask me how I'm doing, I struggle to ask about
Yeah.
things like how other people are doing. And so inevitably I just end up talking about the weather because that's like a go-to. And I
I mean, you're located in England, so that's not
yeah,
a bad
exactly.
conversation starter.
Exactly. And so I think coming from, especially from like my background in math and engineering, like I had built out this life around the idea that I don't need to talk to people. I'm just going to focus on, back
Yeah.
end nerdy stuff, and I never need to talk to them. And then found myself at one point in my life stuck if I don't talk to people. And I realized that I needed to figure out how to have conversations with strangers as a regular thing. And that's not a thing that necessarily came easy to me. And so in order to get over that, I realized that if I prepared as much as I possibly can, if I think through the possible scenarios and the way that the conversation can go and the types of questions that I can ask and how I might respond if they give me a particular answers versus another, I can go into those conversations feeling, I would say, I'd say that it would alleviate my own anxiety to a certain extent. And then it became a thing that made me realize, oh, this actually contributes to a much better experience to the participants as well. And so I just started adopting that approach pretty early on.
Okay, so the key benefits, to paraphrase what you said, is better experience for the on the one hand for both actually interviewer
Mhm.
and interviewee, as well as deeper insights, right, from that particular conversation, because I guess people open up more if it's an eye to eye chat as opposed
Yeah.
to shooting off questions.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Yeah.
the shooting off questions, I mean, whether you're a researcher or a participant, you might have even experienced it in real life. If you go to a
Yeah.
party or social setting and someone just asking a question like they're interrogating you, I don't think that leaves the best impression. Whereas, like, if
Yeah.
you find yourself in a flow of a conversation that feels a little bit more organic, where you're kind of listening and responding to what the person is saying, and that's the other thing, an interrogation can feel very one-sided. Whereas, like, a conversation should feel like it is evolving organically based on what you're learning from the other person. And I
Yeah.
find that as you start and as you get into it that way, participants tend to then open up more, be willing to share more information, be willing to give you deeper insights. It also impacts your own ability to probe deeper. So when you've kind of put it in a place that's comfortable, it doesn't feel like you're interrogating when you ask follow-up questions, or you ask them to tell you why, or you ask them to give you examples. It feels like a much more naturally flowing conversation, which allows them to share more with you, which of course in the end contributes to richer insights.
Yeah, yeah. Let's use your point about playing out the conversation in your head in advance as a segue to focus on discussion guides. And discussion guides are these, and I'm oversimplifying here, so sorry for all the researchers, and correct me, Dalia, if I'm simplifying too much. But like a discussion guide is a document where you put your research goals, what you want to learn from a particular study, and and some questions that you want to ask from your participants to learn about these goals, prove them or disprove them. Um, but you have a slightly different way of building this document, and it
Mhm.
relates to this conversational aspect. I'd like you to explain to us how you build a conversational discussion guide.
Yeah,
What does that
so
look like? Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I would say the first thing that I do is like I actually separate my plan. I think a lot of researchers might relate to that, but I separate my plan from the document that I call the interview or the discussion guide. So The research plan is sort of like all the logistics and the research questions or objectives that I'm trying to meet, which aren't necessarily the same thing as the questions that are in my discussion guide. Those are more high level, internal, they
Hmm.
could be jargony. It's just like, what are we trying to achieve with the study and what are we trying to learn about? Then I have my sort of interview guide. And I remember early on in my career, there was sort of a pretty intentional push in the research community to rebrand these guides from scripts, because that's what they used to be called traditionally, like a research script, to calling them guides, because the idea was that as the field of UX research was evolving, we didn't want researchers to feel like they needed to be bound to a very rigid script of like question, 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 question. How do we create a guide? And so we kind of started creating guides that were just bits and pieces, prompts, topics that you want to follow, just enough on paper to make sure that you kind of had something to follow as you were going through the conversation. And that's how I started as well. I would sort of put down a list of the different topics that I wanted to make sure I covered with the participants, prompts for myself more than anything else. And then I found that just having the prompts does not mean that I'm asking the question in the most effective way that I can be asking the question. And another thing is like, yes, you don't want a rigid script, but it's ideal to try and pose the question in almost exactly the same way to every participant to make sure that you are getting something that's comparable across people. And so, and of course, making sure that like the question that you're asking is has all the hallmarks of a good interview question. So it's open, it's not biased, it's not leading. It is hard to think of all of these things on the fly. Unless you're very, very well seasoned as a researcher, it is hard to think of how to frame a question as in an open, a neutral, a non-leading, and unbiased way on the fly if you haven't thought about it ahead of time. So I started writing out my discussion guides in exactly the voice, the tone, the words that I would want to ask the question, almost like writing out what the conversation would be like, and down to like creating forks in the conversation. If the participant says this, then this is how I'm going to respond. If they say this, then this is how I'm going to respond, and kind of preparing for the potential eventualities of where the conversation would go. And of course, it's hard to get it perfect the first time around. So what I would do is I would take that into my first set of interviews and notice people's reactions to the way I was posing the question. So um, if I noticed that, my first couple of participants would give me blank stares after I asked the question or ask a follow-up clarification question, then that was an indication to me that I needed to go and rewrite that question a little bit differently. Or maybe they reflected back to me words or terminology in how they would say it instead of how I would say it. Then it's like, okay, let me go and tweak my discussion guide. And over time, you start to kind of land on something that flows really organically and that your participants kind of understand and can fully get into.
Amazing. It's really interesting because you're already like ahead of the conversation. You're putting yourself in the shoes of your participant, no? And think about what they will think when they hear that question. Do you like go with the Google Doc? Do you have something more like visual, almost like a flow chart with the branches? What's your approach to document this interview guide?
My approach is I use a Google Doc, but I sort of often recommend to people like use whatever format allows you to parse information quickly. So I don't think it needs to stick to a particular format because I think it's inherently superior. It's about how do you parse information? How do you put it in such a way that you're able to have a conversation with someone and be fully present and read that information as you go along. And for me, it's putting it in linear format in the exact full words that I would use. And I would say that like this idea of preparing and this idea of going through all the possibilities is something that some of you who again might have awkwardness, might have social anxiety, it's probably something you do already in your head. Like if you find yourself the kind of person who, as you're heading to social gatherings or as you're walking away from social gathering, going through conversations in your head, you're probably already in a little bit of that practice. And so if you are, I think putting it down in some sort of documented format is something that is going to help you, first of all, get rid of any jitters you might have going into an interview, but also help you organize your thoughts and think through what you want the conversation to really be like.
Yeah, yeah. Dalia, before we move on to the next topic, I see a couple of
Mhm.
questions that relate to exactly what we're discussing right now. So if you don't mind, I would just throw them on the screen and get your thoughts on that. And Maria's asking is what you do during an interview, how you document what you heard. Is it notes? Is it just a recording? Maybe a combination of the two?
Yeah. So I think I would always record it because there are things that you're definitely going to miss the first time around in the conversation. If you have teammates who can act as note takers, I think that that's also really valuable. And especially if you can give them really clear guidance ahead of time on the kinds of notes that you're looking for them to take. So if you have some sort of template that follows the discussion guide for them to take notes in, that actually, now that I'm answering this, I'm like realizing that this is an added bonus of having really sort of like having structured the conversation ahead of time, is that you can create a template that matches that and makes it really easy for any note takers, including yourself, to be able to take notes as you go along. I think in an ideal world, I would not take notes as an interviewer in order to be fully present. I understand that sometimes that means that going back to interviews and taking notes from the interviews or transcribing can be really time consuming. So I would say just take into account what the urgency and the timeline and the level of risk associated with your research is. If you are doing one of many iterations of usability testing, and the risk is not super high, and you know exactly how the tasks that you're doing are going to go, you know how the conversation is going to go, and you can take some notes as you go along, as long as you capture what's going on. I think that it's okay to do that. But if you are doing some sort of generative or descriptive research, something far more foundational, you're digging into really deep topics with participants, you have to be fully present. You have to make sure that you capture not just what they're saying at face value, but also think about some of the meaning about what they're saying. In that case, I would say, like, as an interviewer, be fully focused on the session, try to record it, have someone else take the notes or record it and go back to it and produce your own notes afterwards.
I have a question on this, like taking notes. I always
Mhm.
take notes when I do user interviews, and one of the reasons is that I realize that I know it splits my attention, but while I'm taking notes, I'm sort of also processing better what the participant said, and I can better formulate follow-up questions or segues to new topic. And I just wanted to ask if I'm like fooling myself and justifying that that I take notes, or is there something into like your mind processing and synthesizing on the spot a little bit better if you put it in the form of a note of what you heard?
Yeah, so I would say that I actually don't disagree with you as in terms of it being potentially a way that you can process information. I'm also quite similar. Like, I go to meetings and I often take notes and I don't review my notes. I take notes as a way of actually just focusing, because otherwise my mind wanders. So I would say, like, there's no black and white, right or wrong answer. Like, it's the process that works for you and helps you make sure that you are present for as much as possible in the conversations. Sometimes what I'll do is I will jot down a little note about something to go back to if I'm not taking full notes. Like, I think if you write down a topic that you're like, they mentioned this and I want to go back to it, I think that that's fine as well. The one thing that I will caution against, though, is when you're taking notes, you should not be passing any sort of judgment on the notes that you are taking. I actually do the same when I interview candidates for roles. I write down exactly everything they're saying, because it is extremely hard to listen to somebody and be doing real-time
And
analysis of what
interpret.
you're
Yeah,
hearing, interpretation exactly at the same
yeah.
time. So if you're the kind of person where taking notes is the way that you can best focus and you have to do it, then just make sure that as you're doing it, like, I write down, as it's almost like live transcription. I'm writing down as much as I possibly can of everything that they're saying. Even when my brain goes into a place where I'm starting to pass to interpret what they're saying, I resist the temptation to do it, or I write it as a very explicit side note to make sure that, like, this is
Yeah.
my interpretation. This is not what they said.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for pointing this out. Very, very, very important. I'm going to use Anton's question about, because this is a question I also had for Dalia. You're in a user call and you get started. Participant tunes in. What are your techniques and how do you go about turning this sort of call where you see the other person in most cases for the first time in your life? How do you turn it into a human conversation as opposed to an interrogation?
Yeah. So I think an interrogation, like I was saying, is kind of a one-sided thing where like I'll come in and I just have a question I need you to answer. I don't care about you. I just need to have my question answered and I just like go in right off the bat and like ask the question and like see what lands. A conversation is something that should feel a little bit more two-sided, and what makes it feel two-sided is the way in which you're asking the question and the extent to which you are able to create some sort of relatedness and some level of comfort with your participant. So when I come into an interview, I of course want to start out with, even before I get into my introduction, a little bit of like human dialogue to kind of break the ice. This is a part you want to be really careful about. And I think Steve Portugal, in his book about interviewing users, does a really good job sort of describing that. You don't want to be their friend. You don't want to give away too much about yourself, because at the end of the day, you are supposed to kind of be warm and friendly, but also neutral in such a way that like they're not going to want to say things just to please you. They're not going to want to say things just to
Hmm.
agree with you. I think of it sometimes in the similar manner of like being a doctor with good bedside manners. I like my doctors to be technicians. I don't want to know. If I'm going to have someone like ask me all kinds of private questions about myself, a doctor, a therapist, whoever, like I don't want to know that they're a person with a life and thoughts and judgment outside of that room. I don't want them to be rude to me either. I want them to
Yeah.
kind of make me feel warm and welcome and ask me how my day is going and, talk about the weather, whatever it is. But I don't want them to start telling me about their family and what they had for dinner and, all of this stuff, because then I'm like, oh, like now I don't, there's just something, there's just a fine line there, I would say, between like bedside
Too
manner,
personal.
friendly rapport versus, yeah, now we've gotten too personal and I don't know if I can share a lot of personal details. And so usually with participants, I'll start with where they're located. Hey, I've noticed you're in such and such, have I, like ask a couple questions. How's the weather out there? Oh, it's that time of day for you. Maybe make a comment on thanks for hopping on early or thanks for hopping on late. Maybe say where I'm situated, if there's any sort of like report to that, but that's kind of it. Then get through the logistics of any sort of, ethical, privacy, NDA considerations, give them a little bit of an overview about what the conversation is going to be about, and then start with some general questions about the sort of like problem domain itself, as opposed to the very pointed question that I'm trying to understand within my like specific research. So, for example, if I were to take Miro as an example, say I wanted to talk to someone about how they create presentations, I wouldn't just go like, tell me how you make presentations. I would go, okay, like, tell me about your role. Tell me about the team that you're in. What's the size of your organization? How are you structured? What's your day to day like? What kind of meetings do you tend to go to? How do you tend to communicate? Um, how do you tend to communicate with different people in your team? Are you hybrid? Do you do a lot more sync or async? Then start to like ease into like, okay, let's talk about like sync communication. What's the preferred format that your team has? Do you tend to prepare a lot ahead of time? Do you tend to do slides? Do you tend to, kind of ease into it that way and see what comes up? I just made all of this up on the fly, by the way. Like this is not, I've not done interviews about
I
PowerPoint
I
presentations.
almost noted it down. It was such a nice flow from generic to pointed
Yeah.
questions. What I also realize here, though, is that by starting from this generic, you also learned a lot of like site data. That's not the right
Yeah.
term for that, but I think all of that, like these data on the fringes, it helps you to interpret when you hear how exactly they're preparing slides,
Mhm.
because you know all that, whether they work sync or async, or
Yeah.
how frequently they do this slides. Um,
I'll add to this as well, actually,
yeah.
like like one of the interesting tricks that you can do with this is if you work in a problem domain where you're embedded in that problem domain, and you always ask every participant across every study that you have the exact same set of opening questions, you're building a knowledge database around that particular topic. So when I did a lot of theme research at Shopify on our theme, so this is the templates that merchants use to um, design their online stores, essentially, I would always ask with like start with the same three questions that were always around like, how did you choose your theme? What were you looking for? How hard was it for you to find your theme? And then eventually, one day down the line, someone in the team might have a question of like, oh, I'm wondering how people choose their themes. And I'm like, oh, I've been collecting this sort of like foundational information for months or years or whatever. So we can go back and we have all of this that we can look at across time and across participants. So in essence, if you can nail your opening questions, your intro into a set of like really powerful standardized questions, doesn't matter what the thing you're testing or the specific study you're doing is, you can over time collect information about that topic and aggregate it.
Cool. This is very valuable. It also reminds me of when Thomas Sharon was my guest. He told me that at WeWork they used to have a standard exit question if somebody canceled like a WeWork subscription. Three questions, open on at high level, so that what the principle was to give the user the driver's wheel.
Mhm.
And they can answer in any way, but always a standard question, so you can see also the patterns and how like feedback that you're getting sort of emerges out of that. What I wanted to ask is, and I'm also looking at the clock here. I have so many more questions, Dalia, and I'm so sorry that I only invited you for 45 minutes. We have to do a part two at one point, and I see thousands, like okay, not thousands, but a lot of questions. So I want to make sure that we give our audience ample time to pick your mind. I have two questions. One on this turning into conversation. Is there anything in the language that you use, anything in the mimic, or just consciously doing report, any sort of body language that you recognized over the course of you doing turning these calls into conversation that they help you to create a conversational atmosphere?
I think, like, yeah, you touch on a really good point around the language, which is if you come into your interview with a specific terminology and you see that the participant is consistently using a different word for it, start using the word that they're using. So, for example, I was just talking about Shopify themes. A lot of people might call them templates. If I'm in a conversation with someone and they keep using the word templates, I'm going to stop saying themes and I'm going to start saying template. And the reason behind that is that it obviously helps you, it creates more comfort and rapport if you're reflecting people's language back to them, but it also plays into removing this perception that you're some sort of expert, and kind of breaking down that barrier a little bit, where when you keep using your own words, what you're implicitly telling them is that I'm right and you're wrong and you need to change what you're saying. And that is not conducive to having someone open up and feel comfortable and share information with you. And so I would say that reflecting that is always really important. Sorry, what was the other part of your question? You asked
No,
about
no. So
language.
this was the first question,
Yeah.
and my last question is then we jump to the audience.
Mhm.
Is about you wrote an article. I
Mhm.
think that was years ago about the privilege of asking questions, and then now I'm gonna zoom out completely from this very tactical how we run interviews. It's that as a user researcher, you tend to be in a position where you get to ask a lot of questions, a lot of times very sensitive, very personal questions from participants. And I, you wrote an article about this, how we need to be responsible about this position. And I'd like to use the chance now that we're speaking to hear and explain to us how exactly where do you see our responsibilities? What do we need to pay particular attention to as we interview participants?
Yeah, I think I wrote that article. It's funny. I was rereading it ahead of this conversation and having a little bit of cringe over like my own writing from 2016. But I think where I came from with that article is that there's a lot of conversations just happening in the public discourse around privilege. And then coupled with things that I was reading, I know I quote a book in there called A More Beautiful Question, which I really recommend reading. And they also talked about the fact that students and people who come from more affluent backgrounds people who come from more affluent backgrounds tend to encourage their kids to ask a lot of questions compared to people who come from maybe different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds that don't have as much privilege. They perceive asking a question as um, a sign of not knowing, which they worry reflects poorly on them. And so, what it got me thinking about is that there's this sort of inherent connection between just being able to ask questions and the amount of privilege that you have. Another example I can give you of that is that I have reached a point in my career where I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of sounding stupid. And because I'm not afraid of sounding stupid, I'm not afraid to be the person who raises my hand in a room and be like, I don't understand. Or to ask a question that can be so fundamental, like, I don't understand the thing you're talking about. I don't understand what this word means. And I'm constantly in documents, in presentations, in conversations asking that. And I know that that's a privilege. I know that not everybody might have. I know that I've learned that other people in the room appreciate it, but I've learned that not everybody
Yeah.
feels comfortable raising their hand and asking those questions. And so all of this gets me to think about the dynamics that happen when we have a participant and what it means to be in the position of being the person who asks questions, whether it is in a participant interview, whether you are hiring people and you're interviewing and you're asking questions, whether you are a leader or an executive to whom work is being presented and you get to ask questions about that work. To ask questions is inherently to come from a position of power. And in our role as researchers, if we really want people to open up and to be vulnerable in certain situations, or at the very least feel comfortable, then we need to break down that perception of that imbalance of power. Like, I have the power and you as my participant don't. Um, and so I became really interested in this idea of like, how do I show up in these conversations in such a way that people believe or feel like they are
Mm.
the ones in charge of the conversation, that I'm just a neutral person who's just trying to understand them as much as possible. And I think this again plays a little bit into what I was saying earlier around not giving away too much of yourself. It kind of helps with that perception when you make space for them and you kind of you make yourself smaller in the conversation. It gives them more room. And I think, yeah, like I said, this all ties into these notions of privilege and examining what our own role is and how do we want to shift that.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing. All of you like listening to this and watching us, Dalia has Medium accounts, and if you search for Dalia Medium, there's a good chance you're going to bump into this article right away. I'm also going to share it in the newsletter. It's worthwhile going through that. It makes you think about your position as a UX researcher. Now, we have a lot of questions here, Dali, and I don't know how to deal with that, but I think I'm going to introduce a new rule. And the new rule will be that I will throw you a question at you, and you'll have about a minute to answer. Okay? And if we see that it doesn't work, we pivot.
Okay.
If it works, we try to cover as much as possible. If any of
Okay.
you like don't get your questions answered, I'm gonna make sure that I somehow help you to pick Dalia's mind and get back to you. Okay?
Okay. Are you going to keep time or am I? Because I can tell you right now that conciseness, people may have noticed on the call, but conciseness is not my strong suit. So if we think we're going to stick to a minute, I think I need to set up a timer for myself. So it
Yeah,
happens.
yeah. I mean, you tell this to a son of a philosopher who has a tendency to talk way too much. So, anyhow, let's get started. I'm going to put Jayapal's question up there. He asked this while we were talking about turning user calls into conversations, asking about what kind of tools you use for your conducting specifically interview sessions.
So yeah, so at Wise right now, we tend to use Zoom for conducting them. We also use user testing primarily for unmoderated, but in some cases also moderated research with participants that we don't have access to in our database. And at Miro, we used user Zoom actually, and that we used it for moderated research as a way to sort of like integrate all of the things that we needed in one place.
Cool, thank you. We're good. We're good.
Okay.
The next question from Pallavi, a very interesting angle. How you deal with a chatty participant who like get off course and you try to put them back, but not discourage them in the conversation.
I find that one of the most difficult to deal with. I grew up in Canada and I have this like overbearing sense of like Canadian politeness and not wanting to make people feel comfortable. I think that if I'm in a situation like that where the participant is really chatty, first of all, I ask myself, uh, can I go over time if I really need to? Like, what's my schedule like? Try to establish that with the participant as well, if they have a hard stop or no. Based on that, decide how much more time I have for the conversation. And then looking at my discussion guide, I try to be really to sort of like determine on the fly what are the non-negotiable questions I need to get through. Maybe I won't get through everything on my list, but it's almost like a process of prioritization. For example, I tend to have usually a set of like outro questions just to ease out of the conversation. Maybe I'm going to skip those for the purposes of this discussion. If you're doing tasks, as part of usability testing, then I think it can be a little bit easier because you can kind of keep your participant on track and say like, okay, we have like this many more tasks we want to get through. Just want to make sure that we get through them. So I think that that helps as well. As a side note, I find redirecting conversations in meetings and in workshops, it's a skill that you can transfer there. And that's also like really hard to do, how to be in a room when a conversation is really lively and to kind of like interject and be like, hey, I know we want to keep talking about this, but we're going to park it. I'm sweating now just thinking about having to do that. But I would say if you can develop that skill in your interviews and take it to other parts of your life, it can also be extremely useful.
Or practice in work meetings and then transfer it
Also
to
good.
user interviews the other way around.
Yeah.
Jayapal, a quick shout out to you. I saw that you posted a few questions. I'll try to come back to you, but want to give some airtime to everyone in the audience. So I'm going to jump now to Manasi's question um, about users saying something but doing something else. And how do you navigate through that? It's a
Yeah.
slippery one too.
Yeah, I think that that's like one of the sort of like tenets of any qualitative research or any user research is that what people say and what they do are not always the same thing. So I would say this is where learning how to ask follow-up questions and probe and learning to do so gently rather than interrogating becomes really handy. So you don't want to say things like, what do you mean? Or, just kind of like be really critical about what they're saying, but if you're hearing that they're saying something, try to reflect their words back to them and say, you mentioned that you do this. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or try to do it in a way where you're kind of reflecting it back to them and using that as a way to kind of ease into understanding the meaning behind it. Also, in keeping in mind with our point about privilege, when you say users tend to say something, but their behaviors reflect something different, take a moment to reflect on whether that's your interpretation. Like, is that your position of privilege where you have an idea of what the answer needs to be in your mind, but they're doing it differently? I think if you are genuinely coming at it from like an unbiased perspective and truly trying to understand what it is that they're saying and doing, then find a way to reflect it back to them and use that as a way to ease into some follow-up questions.
Amazing. Let's just move on. I'm looking up the next question. Dalia, is it okay if we go a few minutes over time, or do you have a hard cut in 2 minutes?
No, no,
Thank you.
I can stay on.
Thank you. I have a question from Claire about avoiding to sound blaming users in user interviews.
I'm actually curious why that happens, or like when does one find themselves in a situation where there might be even something that gets interpreted as a blame towards the user. So unless we can ask Claire some follow-up questions,
Um,
I think that, yeah, my
yeah,
answer
I'm
is
ho I'm hope
neither.
she's still here. So
Okay.
Claire, if you're still tuned in, if you can give a bit more context, maybe an experience that you had recently that you're willing to share, I think that would help Dalia to answer your question. We're going to come back to that. We have a question from Chloe about documenting your notes and insights and making them accessible. What's your take? It's a big topic.
Yeah.
But
I think
try to squeeze it into 1 minute, Dalia, please.
I mean, I could squeeze it in for in less than a minute. It's wherever your team spends the most time is where you should keep things. If you have a team that spends all their time on Confluence, then go there. If you have a team that spends all their time on Google Drive, then keep your stuff there. If you have a team that's like really lively in Slack conversations, you can even think about threading your notes and your videos into some sort of Slack channel. So at the end of the day, I mean, if I bring it back to like what's the job to be done is to make sure that your team has access to the information that they need when they're making decisions. And the easiest way to do that is just to keep it in whatever ecosystem they're already in.
Okay, thank you. I have this is the last question from Jack and Claire. If you make it, you still have the chance to put your question on the screen. But the question from Jack is how you transition when you in user interviews when you have multiple subjects that you'd like to touch on and you sort of learned all you wanted to
Yeah.
about a particular subject.
Yeah, it's actually a lot easier and more obvious than you think. I'll tend to say, thanks so much for sharing that. That was really interesting. I'd like to shift gears a little bit now and talk about X. So I just make it really explicit so that they don't feel like like I'm not interested in the topic and I'm jumping into something else. I just say, cool, like that was really interesting. Can we switch gears and dive onto this other topic? So yeah.
Okay, got that. Got that. I have well, let's see. In the comments, I see that about Claire's question. I'm going to put Claire's question up there about not blaming something. And Pallavi from the audience says, like, what about if the interview is sustainability related, right? When the topic is about reducing carbon dioxide and being responsible with the nature and some of the behaviors that we exhibit as human beings, they're not necessarily reducing CO2 to the bare minimum. What's your take on this?
My take on this in a scenario like that is that honestly, my primary concern would be how it's not about like me necessarily the worry that I might blame the users. I would say, how do I get people to open up honestly as much as possible about a behavior that they feel might reflect poorly on them from like a social desirability sort of perspective. So my job there is not to pass judgment on what they're doing. My job is to get them to be as honest as possible about what they're doing. And so I think you do that by, again, not passing any judgment whatsoever. Just keep it really objective, ask about their habits. Don't imply that one is good, one is bad, anything like that. This is where your discussion guide can come in really handy because there might be a series of topics that you'd be interested in diving into and having those. So to give you an example, say composting, right? Um, some people might feel uneasy to say, I don't compost. And the way that you frame the question might make it seem like they're wrong for not composting. So I might not necessarily put a question in there about like, do you compost? I would ask a question about their routine and how they prepare food and what's their process for cleaning up after they do food. And maybe it goes towards the angle of composting, maybe it doesn't. And in that case, I would ask them, like why they've developed that particular routine that works for them. And then I would be curious to understand what are some of the environmental factors or some of the other things that are happening in their homes that would lead them to engage in that one behavior versus another. So again, not coming at it from a like, this is the expected behavior and I want you to do it, but rather what are the questions that can help me understand the broader environment that they're operating in, the motivations that they have behind their behaviors, and the factors that are leading to them to behave in one way or another. And I think when you keep it that way, I don't know, I would presume it comes very differently from being like, do you compost or do you not compost? It's just like more broadly, what are your food preparation and cleanup methods as part of your day-to-day routines?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Alia. I see a few more questions. I'm gonna make a cut here, and sorry for that, everyone. I put the links for Dalia as well as myself. So if you had a question and it's important for you, get in touch with either of us, and I promise you you'll get an answer. That's why we're here. I'm eternally grateful to you, Dalia, for all the wisdom that you shared with us today. I learned a lot, and I'm quite sure the audience as well. I'm grateful for the audience. It's been a lively chatter in the chat and the comment section. I love seeing that when people build on each other's comments and opinions and questions. This is why we are here, and this is how we can learn the most. So thanks about that. Without further, yeah, I think that's all for now. I have the next webinar in 2 weeks. This is going to be about user recruitment, how you recruit users continuously. And we're going to be taking the examples and learnings from Colossian, a successful Series B company building digital avatars for educational purposes. So that's for that. Um, Thanks for being here. Thanks for
Yeah,
listening to
my
us.
pleasure.
And hope to see all of you around in upcoming webinars. And Deli, I hope to see you around as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Akash. Nice to be here, and thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.